by any significant action.
Hear to that. Let's bring in Stephen Ciobo, representing the government, Federal Frontbencher. Thanks very much for joining us on To The Point. Let me ask you, Mr Ciobo, why so many words and so little action when 2 women every week are dying from domestic violence? We seem to beat up terrorism and leave women to be beaten up and killed in their homes.
Well, I don't think that that's an accurate summation.
It's pretty much exactly what's happening. It's a talk fest, as Kristina Keneally just articulated. It's been deferred to the next COAG meeting, and in between that deferral, many, many women will die in their own homes.
Well, Peter, I frankly think it's overly cynical for you to portray it like that. The fact is that both the federal government and state government are very focused on domestic violence. We've had a very strong domestic violence agenda. We've got extra funding that's going into it, and has really become a central part of both state and federal government's focus. So I don't think it's an appropriate thing to say, to suggest that premiers are sitting there and the Prime Minister are sitting there and not really caring about what's happening in the domestic violence space.
So you turn it into black or white, Mr Ciobo. You make it black or white. I'm not making it black or white. I'm not saying they don't care. I'm saying that it's rhetoric, exactly as Kristina Keneally says, rather than action.
Well, indeed, Steve Ciobo, I mean, they've said that not only are they going to need a third meeting to design and deliver a national advertising campaign to discourage domestic violence, but indeed they haven't even yet decided on a national scheme for domestic violence orders. Something that would cross state lines for a person who's been put under a domestic violence order. It just seems to me that we are not giving the same amount of urgency at a national level to this issue of domestic violence as we are to the issue of terrorism, and Rosie Batty's words are striking a chord here.
Well, look, Christine, I mean, obviously, as you yourself know, there's a separate, and they're 2 separate things. There's a separation between saying things aren't happening to harmonise and things aren't happening full stop. Now, you're saying to me, well, we're not getting harmonisation across Australia and it should be happening more quickly than it is. But that's an entirely separate proposition to saying that each jurisdiction isn't tackling the issue of domestic violence. The fact is that we are dealing with domestic violence. Now, does that mean that we've got the formula perfect? Does that mean there's not room for improvement? Of course it doesn't. There is room for improvement, but it's important that we do this not in a piecemeal way, but in a coordinated way, in a harmonised way, so we're actually in agreement on that issue. But let's not pretend that it's a case of nothing's being done. My point is simply to stress that a lot is being done at a state and territory level. A lot's being done in terms of being a new initiative for the federal government as well around domestic violence. And so I do think we are making progress. Now, if you want to be critical and say we're not making progress quickly enough, I guess you can say that. But I've got to say that the government, and this applies to all tiers of government, we take our advice based upon the advice that we receive from those who are at the coalface, the police officers, emergency service workers and others.
You know, you may make a fair point that this is more a matter for state and local jurisdictions rather than it is a national level issue, but the Prime Minister is the person who has chosen to make it a national level issue. He has chosen to speak out about it, and yet he still presides over a process that is now taking months and months to develop an advertising campaign, and at the same time we are seeing money cut from domestic violence services, we are seeing money cut from homeless services, we are seeing money cut from legal aid services that would support women at the coalface. So it is growing quite frustrating to see a COAG process that just goes on and on and on, and as my colleague Peter has said, by the time we get to the 3rd COAG meeting that's dealt with this issue, more women will have undoubtedly died, and indeed more women will die of domestic violence in the next few months than will die from terrorism. We haven't drugged the chain on terrorism. It's very frustrating to see this government and this COAG going so slow on the issue of domestic violence.
Well, Christine, I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that, you know, there's just not enough happening at every state, territory and federal government level. And look, that's a fair criticism if that's your perspective. I can only repeat again that I think it's wrong to characterise there being no action taking here. I also think it's incorrect to say that there's actually been a decrease in funding around domestic violence, because that certainly isn't the case with respect to the federal government. So we've increased resources. We're wanting to harmonise the process. I know people always get frustrated with governments because it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's domestic violence, and that is of course very important. important. But whether it's health changes, whether it's infrastructure, on every measure, the fact is that governments are often perceived to move way too slowly. That's a fair criticism, it's a fair cop, but I do think, though, that people are approaching this with the right intentions, the correct bona fides, and I have no doubt that with the increased focus and emphasis, there will be better changes that are brought about.
Can I ask a segue question, Stephen Ciobo? Your portfolio area takes in obviously foreign affairs. It's something that terrorism is high on the agenda and the discussion point when we talk to people like yourself or the Minister Julie Bishop. Why do you think it is, not with heat in the debate, but a genuine dialogue? Why is it, do you think, all sides of politics fall into this, and I think the public does as well? Why is it that we put such a focus on terrorism, the threat of terrorism, when, frankly, the numbers that are affected by it, even at its kind of worst at a domestic level, do pale into insignificance around other things? I don't want to just talk about domestic violence, but, accidents on our roads, all the rest of it. Is the emotional stock in it just the sheer sort of terror that you do see when something like the Martin Place siege happens?
No, I think that there's, and again, I would split between where the media might choose to focus, and this isn't a criticism, but where the media might choose to focus, and then the work that's being undertaken. I mean, take, for example, domestic violence. Take, for example, safety on roads. It's interesting you should raise those 2 points, Peter, because I can tell you, in terms of my work that I've been involved with throughout the Pacific, with a number of our regional neighbours that Australia, of course, runs a very strong aid program for, the fact is that we are doing a lot of work around those 2 aspects in particular, domestic violence and road safety, because we know that we can save a lot of lives through Australia's involvement on a foreign aid basis with our near neighbours. So, I mean, you won't ever see that reported. It's not a sexy issue that gets a run compared to something like terrorism, which does get a run. But I just want to stress that the suggestion that in some way the government's focus is on terrorism to the exclusion of other things is simply not correct, because we're much more comprehensive than that.
I accept that, and I know government does lots of things, lots of which doesn't get reported on, but it doesn't help with the debate when the Prime Minister of the country comes up and tells us all that ISIS are coming for us with a message of submit or die, and yet, again, I come back to my point, can't over a 6-month period manage to get a national advertising campaign up just to tell people not to hit women. These are significant leadership issues, and it does come down to the language used by the Prime Minister and the focus put on certain things by the government.
Well, Christina, to be fair, the Prime Minister has also made numerous comments and numerous statements about domestic violence. So, I think you're choosing to focus on certain particular areas and forgetting about, let's call them some inconvenient facts. The fact is that the Prime Minister has made domestic violence an important issue now during his stewardship of our nation. He has presided over, as Prime Minister, a number of federal initiatives. He's made it an agenda item for COAG discussion. Now,
and indeed for the next COAG discussion.
Well, but I mean, look, we can, as I said, you can be critical about the pace of which changes happen in our federation. And, I'm not going to disagree that sometimes they almost seem to be glacial. But that notwithstanding, the fact is that state, territory and federal level, all tiers of government do work to try to reduce the incidence of harm in the community, and in particular with respect to, for example, domestic violence. Now, I'm just going to pull the 2 of you up because I don't think it's fair to characterise it as not much is going on and it's all just a talk fest, because that's not an accurate summation of what's taking place. The fact is there are a lot of initiatives and a lot of money that's going into domestic violence and trying to prevent domestic violence. What we're actually talking about is harmonisation of those initiatives across the Federation. Yes, that might be taking longer than people would like, but I also think it's important to get it right, to make sure it's going to be meaningful and, most importantly, make sure it's going to be impactful.
Just quickly, if I can, Stephen Ciobo, your reaction to the Labor Party's change of hearts on towbacks. Do you believe them? Kevin Rudd, of course, said the same thing ahead of the 2007 election.
Well, Peter, which Labor Party? Is it the Labor Party that Bill Shorten's a member of, or is it the Labor Party that Tanya Plibersek's a member of? Because
I think it's the Labor Party that's leading 53-47, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure which
long,
Labor Party that is, because Christina, I mean, it seems to me that Labor is speaking out about both sides of their mouths. We've seen Labor have form on this. The fact is that, unfortunately, Bill Shorten couldn't even keep Labor's position consistent from 7:30 p.m. last night to 7:30 a.m. this morning. We've seen Labor already starting to water down their rhetoric around boat turnbacks. you know, I think it's quite clear if you look at Labor's track record in this area, and a part of me does welcome the fact that Bill Shorten acknowledges that Labor got it so woefully wrong when they were in government. It's just an absolute tragedy that 1,200 people drowned at sea, that more than 820 boats arrived, more than 50,000 people, and that it cost taxpayers more than $12 billion for Labor's massive stuff up with respect to our borders.
Stephen Ciobo, thanks for finding the time to talk to us on To The Point. Thank